A traffic stop could take an unexpected turn. Immigration enforcement is coming to Texas highways as part of a new agreement between the state and the federal government.
Good evening. Tonight we need to talk about something that's about to reshape life for hundreds of thousands of people living in Texas. And the truth is, most people outside the communities directly affected don't fully understand what's coming or how quickly it's going to happen. Texas is moving forward with a set of immigration enforcement measures that go far beyond anything we've seen at the state level before. And if you live in Texas, if you know anyone who lives in Texas, if you do business with Texas, or if you're watching what's happening in state politics across this country, you need to understand what's about to unfold because the timeline is tight and the consequences are enormous. Right now, as we speak, Texas state lawmakers are advancing several bills through the current legislative session that would fundamentally change how immigration enforcement works within state borders. We're not talking about federal policy here. We're talking about Texas taking immigration enforcement into its own hands in ways that states historically haven't done. And the key detail everyone needs to grasp is this: if these measures pass, and the momentum suggests they very well might, implementation would begin as early as the middle of next year, 2026. That's not some distant future. That's months away. And what that means in practical terms is that people who have built entire lives in Texas over the past 5, 10, 15 years, people who wake up every morning, go to work, pay rent, buy groceries, take their kids to school, people who are part of the fabric of their communities, those people are suddenly looking at a situation where everything could change almost overnight. Let me walk you through what's actually in these proposals because the details matter and they affect real human beings in very specific ways. First, these bills would give local law enforcement. We're talking about city police, county sheriffs, officers who patrol your neighborhoods and highways. They would get new authority to check immigration status during what we call routine stops. Think about that for a second. A broken taillight, a rolling stop at a stop sign, a minor traffic violation that normally results in a warning or a small ticket. Under these new rules, that same interaction could lead to detention based on immigration status. This isn't something that would only happen at the border or during major criminal investigations. This would be woven into everyday interactions between police and residents across the entire state. Now, some people might hear that and think, well, if someone broke the law by being here without documentation, isn't that reasonable? And I understand that perspective, but let me explain why this creates complications that go way beyond simple law enforcement. When you introduce immigration status checks into routine policing, you change the relationship between entire communities and the police. People who might otherwise report crimes, who might serve as witnesses, who might call for help during domestic violence situations or medical emergencies, they stop engaging with law enforcement because they're afraid. And it's not just the undocumented individuals themselves. We're talking about their family members, their neighbors, anyone who might be connected to someone without legal status. Fear spreads through communities, and when that happens, everyone becomes less safe, not more safe. But the proposals go further than traffic stops. There's a major component focused on employment, and this is where things get really concrete for businesses and workers across multiple industries. The bills would require employers to use verification systems that check the immigration status of their workers. Now, some version of this already exists at the federal level through something called E-Verify, but these Texas proposals would make it mandatory across the board and would create immediate consequences for both employers and employees. What does that actually mean? It means that if you're working in construction, if you're employed on a farm, if you're in a restaurant kitchen, if you're cleaning hotel rooms, if you're doing landscaping, any job where a significant portion of the workforce might be undocumented, the verification process could lead to immediate job loss. Not a warning, not a grace period, immediate termination and potential reporting to authorities. Think about the chain reaction that creates. An employer in the construction industry who's been working with the same crew for years suddenly has to verify everyone's status. Half the crew can't pass the check. Those workers lose their jobs immediately. The employer now has to find replacements, which in many sectors is nearly impossible because these are jobs that U.S. citizens either don't want to do or aren't available to do in the numbers needed. Projects get delayed, costs go up, deadlines are missed, contracts fall through. And this isn't just happening to one employer. This is happening across entire industries simultaneously. Agriculture is particularly vulnerable here, and Texas has massive agricultural operations that depend heavily on immigrant labor. When harvest season comes, farmers need workers, and they need them fast. The crops don't wait. If verification systems suddenly make a large portion of the available workforce unemployable, what happens to those crops? They rot in the fields. Food prices go up because supply drops. Farms lose money, some of them catastrophic amounts. Rural communities that depend on agricultural income suffer economic hits they weren't prepared for. And the ripple effects spread from there through local businesses, through tax revenues, through school funding, through everything that makes a community function. The hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, this is another sector that would feel the impact immediately. Texas has enormous tourism and hospitality sectors, particularly in cities like Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin. These industries operate on tight margins and they depend on being fully staffed to function. When you suddenly remove a significant portion of the workforce through mandatory verification, those businesses face impossible choices. Do they cut services? Do they reduce hours? Do they close locations? Do they try to raise wages dramatically to attract different workers, which might not even be possible because the labor pool might not exist? These aren't abstract economic questions. These are decisions that affect whether people have jobs, whether businesses survive, whether neighborhoods have the services they depend on. Now let's talk about something that gets less attention but might be even more devastating for families. These proposals include language that could cut off access to certain public services, and here's where it gets particularly harsh. Even in mixed status families, where some members are U.S. citizens and others are not, the access to services could be restricted. Imagine a family where the parents are undocumented but the children were born in the United States, which makes those kids citizens. Under current systems, those children can access things like public education, emergency medical care, nutrition assistance programs. But if these new rules allow the state to deny services based on the immigration status of family members, those citizen children could lose access to help they're legally entitled to because of their parents' status. Let me paint a picture of what that looks like in real life. A mother brings her son to a public clinic because he has an ear infection. She's undocumented, but her son is a U.S. citizen. Under these new rules, the clinic might be required to verify her status before providing care to her citizen son. She's afraid to go. The boy's ear infection gets worse. It turns into something more serious. Eventually, they end up in an emergency room, which costs far more money and treats a far more serious condition than would have been necessary if they'd gotten simple care early. This doesn't just hurt that family. It creates public health risks for everyone, and it drives up healthcare costs that taxpayers end up covering anyway. The logic of denying preventive care to save money actually ends up costing more money and creating more problems. Schools are another flashpoint here, and this is where communities could see visible, immediate changes that would be impossible to ignore. Right now, schools in Texas don't check immigration status. If a child lives in a district, they can attend school there, period. That's based on a Supreme Court decision from decades ago that established the right of all children to public education regardless of immigration status. But these new Texas measures are pushing boundaries, and while they might not directly deny education to children, they create an environment where families are terrified to send their kids to school because any interaction with government systems could lead to detention or deportation. When parents start keeping kids home because they're afraid, schools see enrollment drop. They lose funding that's based on attendance numbers. Teachers lose jobs. Programs get cut. And the children themselves, who had nothing to do with immigration decisions made by their parents, lose education opportunities that could have changed the trajectory of their entire lives. I want to pause here and make something very clear because this is a point that often gets lost in these discussions. We're not talking about people who just arrived yesterday. The vast majority of undocumented immigrants living in Texas right now have been there for years, often many years. They own homes or they've been renting the same apartment for a decade. They have children who've never lived anywhere else. They have jobs they've held for years with employers who depend on them and value them. They coach little league teams. They volunteer at churches. They help neighbors. They've built lives, and those lives are woven into the communities where they live. When you talk about enforcing immigration law at this scale and with this speed, you're not just dealing with legal abstractions. You're talking about tearing apart the actual fabric of communities, separating families, leaving houses empty, closing small businesses, creating holes in schools and workplaces and neighborhoods that can't be quickly filled. The state government's argument for all of this centers on two main points. First, they say it's necessary to reduce strain on public resources. The idea is that undocumented immigrants use services like schools, hospitals, roads, emergency services, and they don't pay enough in taxes to cover the cost of those services. Second, they frame it as a security issue, arguing that the state needs to know who's living within its borders and needs to be able to remove people who shouldn't be there. Now, those are arguments worth examining, so let's look look at them honestly. On the resource question, the economics are actually much more complicated than the simple narrative suggests. Undocumented immigrants do use public services, that's true, but they also pay substantial amounts in taxes. Every time someone buys something in Texas, they pay sales tax regardless of immigration status. Many undocumented immigrants pay rent to landlords who then pay property taxes. Lots of undocumented workers have taxes withheld from paychecks using tax identification numbers, and those workers often can't claim the refunds or benefits they'd be entitled to, which means that money stays in the system. Multiple economic studies have looked at the net fiscal impact of undocumented immigrants, and while there are costs, there are also significant contributions, and when you factor in the economic activity they generate, the businesses they support by being consumers, the jobs they create by starting businesses themselves, the overall economic picture is far more balanced than political rhetoric often suggests. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. When you suddenly remove hundreds of thousands of people from an economy, you don't just remove the costs of serving them, you also remove all of their economic contributions. The taxes they pay disappear, the money they spend at local businesses disappears, the rent they pay disappears, the labor they provide disappears. Entire sectors of the economy contract, and in many cases the economic damage from that contraction outweighs whatever savings you might theoretically get from not providing services to those individuals. On the security argument, this is where perspectives diverge pretty sharply. There are legitimate questions about border security and about having functional immigration systems that track who enters and leaves the country. No one seriously argues that countries shouldn't have borders or immigration laws. But what we're talking about here in Texas goes beyond border security. This is about internal enforcement far from the border, directed at people who are already embedded in communities. And the question becomes whether the security benefits of that kind of enforcement outweigh the social and economic costs. There's also a practical question about whether it even works. Deportation and detention are expensive. Courts are backlogged. And historically, aggressive internal enforcement hasn't prevented unauthorized immigration so much as it's pushed it underground, made people more fearful and less cooperative, and created humanitarian crises without solving the underlying policy problems. What makes this moment particularly significant is that Texas is doing this at a time when federal immigration policy is uncertain and inconsistent. Normally, immigration enforcement is primarily a federal responsibility. The federal government controls the borders, runs the immigration courts, handles deportations, sets the policy. States have typically had limited roles, but Texas is asserting much more state-level control, essentially saying that if the federal government won't enforce immigration law the way Texas wants, Texas will do it itself, and that creates a bunch of complicated legal questions that will probably end up in court. Can a state really conduct immigration enforcement that's traditionally been a federal function? Can states create their own immigration policies that might conflict with federal policies? These are constitutional questions without clear answers, and the legal battles could last years. But here's what matters for people living this reality right now. Legal battles take time. Cases work their way through courts slowly. And in the meantime, while judges are figuring out what's constitutional and what's not, these enforcement measures could be in effect and people's lives would be getting turned upside down. A legal victory 2 years from now doesn't help a family that's been separated today. It doesn't restore a business that closed. It doesn't bring back a child's education that was disrupted. The legal uncertainty creates a situation where people have to make major life decisions with incomplete information about what's actually going to be allowed to stand. So what should people be paying attention to right now? First, watch the legislative calendar. These bills are moving through the Texas legislature, and there are specific points where they could pass or fail. Committee hearings, floor votes, these are the moments when the actual policy gets set. Second, pay attention to what your local law enforcement says. County sheriffs and city police chiefs have discretion in how they implement state laws, and some have already said they won't prioritize immigration checks, while others have said they'll enforce whatever the state requires. Where you live within Texas could make a huge difference in how this plays out in practice. Third, if you're an employer or you work in industries that employ significant numbers of immigrants, start thinking now about what verification requirements would mean for your workforce and your business. Waiting until the law takes effect to figure out how you're going to comply is waiting too long. For families who might be directly affected, the considerations are much more personal and much more urgent. This is the kind of situation where people need to talk to lawyers who specialize in immigration law, and I mean actual lawyers, not notaries or consultants who might be offering services they're not qualified to provide. Understanding your specific situation, what options might exist, what rights you have, that information could be critical and these conversations need to happen now, not after enforcement starts. There's also the question of what to prepare for. Do you have copies of important documents? Do family members know what to do if someone gets detained? Do children know who would take care of them? These are painful questions that no family should have to think about, but in the current reality, being prepared could make a significant difference. For everyone else, even if you're not directly affected by your own immigration status, think about how this changes your community. If you own a business, are you going to lose workers or customers? If you're in a neighborhood with immigrant families, are you prepared for people to suddenly disappear, for houses to sit empty, for kids to stop showing up at school? If you rely on industries that depend on immigrant labor, construction, agriculture, food service, are you ready for prices to go up or availability to go down? These changes don't only affect the people being targeted. They ripple out through entire communities and entire economic sectors. There's also the question of what kind of place we want Texas to be, and by extension, what kind of country we want America to be. Immigration has always been contentious, and people have strong feelings on all sides. Some genuinely believe that strict enforcement is necessary and right. Others believe it's cruel and counterproductive. Those are value judgments that individuals and communities have to wrestle with. But what's happening in Texas right now is forcing those abstract debates into concrete reality. When you pass laws that give police new powers and employers new obligations and schools new restrictions, you're not just making policy, you're deciding what kind of society you're building and who gets to be part of it and on what terms. What we're watching unfold in Texas could be a preview of what happens in other states. If Texas implements these measures and other states decide it's working, they might pass their own versions. If Texas implements them and it creates chaos, economic damage, legal problems, humanitarian crises, other states might decide to go a different direction. But Texas is essentially running an experiment right now, and the subjects of that experiment are human beings with lives and families and communities. The results of that experiment will shape immigration policy and enforcement for years to come, and not just in Texas. The timeline is the crucial thing to keep in mind. Mid-2026 is not far away. For legislation moving through the current session, we're talking about bills that could be signed into law within months, with implementation beginning shortly after. That's an incredibly compressed timeline for something this significant. It doesn't give people time to adjust, to prepare, to make informed decisions about their futures. It doesn't give communities time to think through the consequences or to put support systems in place. It doesn't give businesses time to restructure their operations. It's designed to move fast, and that speed is part of the point. Supporters of these measures want quick, visible enforcement. Critics say that kind of speed guarantees chaos and suffering. Whatever happens in the next few months will be shaped by politics, by legal challenges, by economic pressures, by how communities respond, by what law enforcement does on the ground. There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of unknowns, but what's not unknown is that this is happening. It's happening now, and it's going to affect hundreds of thousands of people directly and millions more indirectly. This isn't a theoretical debate anymore. This is policy becoming reality, and that reality is going to reshape communities across Texas in ways we're only beginning to understand. So where does this leave us? If you're in Texas, or if you're connected to Texas in any way, you need to be paying attention to what's happening in the state legislature right now. You need to understand how these proposals would work in practice and what they would mean for your community. You need to think about whether you want to take action, whether that's contacting legislators, participating in public hearings, organizing in your community, supporting affected families, whatever makes sense for your values and your situation. This is the moment when engagement matters, because once these bills become law and enforcement starts, the options narrow dramatically. And if you're watching this from outside Texas, don't think this doesn't concern you. What Texas does influences national conversations. It sets precedents. It provides models that other states might follow or react against. Immigration policy in America has always been shaped by what happens at the state and local level as much as by what happens in Washington. And right now, Texas is asserting itself as a major force in that conversation, pushing the boundaries of what states can do, testing the limits of enforcement, and creating a new reality that the rest of the country will have to respond to one way or another. The coming months are going to be critical. Watch what happens with these bills. Watch how communities respond. Watch whether legal challenges charges materialize and what courts say. Watch what actually happens on the ground when enforcement begins. And most importantly, remember that behind all the policy and politics are real people trying to live their lives, raise their families, contribute to their communities, and navigate a system that's becoming increasingly unpredictable and unforgiving. Those stories, those human realities, those are what matter most in all of this, and those are what we need to keep at the center of how we think about immigration enforcement, not just in Texas, but everywhere. I'm going to keep following this story as it develops because it's one of the most significant policy shifts happening in America right now, and it's going to have consequences that extend far beyond Texas borders and far beyond immigration policy alone. If you want to stay informed as this unfolds, make sure you're following this channel, subscribe if you haven't already, turn on notifications so you don't miss updates, and please share this with people who need to understand what's happening, because the more people are informed, the better equipped we all are to navigate what's coming and to participate meaningfully in the decisions being made. Leave a comment and let me know what you're seeing in your community, what questions you have, what concerns you're wrestling with. These conversations matter, and they're more important now than ever. Thank you for watching, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.